Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joel Mitchell. How are you today, Joel?
I just did a big yawn, so apparently I'm still a bit sleepy and waking up. I have had some coffee, but maybe not enough.
Yeah. Well, it's 9:30. It's not particularly early.
It's not, no. I think I maybe just didn't get to sleep last night at my usual time.
Was it that? Oh, okay. It was a late night, not your aircon this time. That was
No. Oh, it was neither. It was just one of those nights where you lay there and can't get to sleep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, nothing in particular.
Nice. So what's going on in the world of Joel?
World of Joel, we accepted an offer on our investment property, so we can, pending finance, get rid of that finally.
Yeah, congratulations. That went pretty quick as we expected it might.
Yeah, it was on the second home open. So I think we've really just got in time because the market's starting to shift in Perth now with the interest rates changing. So yeah, fortunate that we got it when we did.
Yeah, look at you and Alicia. You're all grown up, like doing grown up things like selling houses.
I know. Who would have thought that, people our age would be doing grown up things?
Yeah, I know,
despite being millennials.
Yeah, that's right. Well, good on you.
You do grown up things too.
Like what?
I mean, you
name one.
You own a business.
Yeah.
You talk to investors.
Yeah.
Don't you? You have an investment property. You just redid the bathroom on that. Bathroom renovation is a pretty adult thing to do.
I didn't do it myself.
But you still had it done.
Yeah, okay. Maybe I do adult a bit. Yeah, when I need to. It's not my preferred.
Outsourcing is still adulting.
Yeah. It's not my preferred way of operating.
No, I know that.
Yeah. Good. As long as you know that.
I've known you for a little over a year, and it took me about 30 seconds to realize that.
Anyway, hey, look, we should probably introduce our guest in.
Yep.
He's a bit of an adult as well. He spent more than 20 years actually in health and safety with international postings across Australia, Spain, and the UK. He's had senior leadership roles across Lendlease, ACOM, and Woolworths, and is currently the General Manager, Health, Safety and Environment at Mirvac. Welcome to the podcast, Brian. Brian, I am really struggling today. Sorry, mate. Maybe I need another coffee as well.
Yeah, you're not enunciating very well.
No, I'm not on my game today, Brian. Sorry, mate. Hopefully you can carry us.
Yeah, well, hopefully I can. Yeah, it's great to be here, and looking forward to a conversation.
Yeah, no, really great to have you on, Brian.
So before we get into serious questions, we do like to first ask, what are you listening to? Any podcasts?
Oh, wow. Yeah, look, I'm listening to a variety of things, I think, at the moment. A little bit from the sort of health, safety, environment world, Dave Proven, Drew Ray. It's always a good podcast to listen into. Plenty of sports stuff as well. I'm a big Real Madrid tragic, so listen to Spanish radio podcasts and stuff on the soccer front. Big game coming up on the 28th of May, Champions League. So, wanting to be across all of that. And then just sort of a variety of different things, news outlets, just sort of social commentary really. But yeah, we've got a new puppy at home. So unfortunately that's sort of taking most of my attention at night. So yes, what used to be podcast time is now feeding and toilet training time. But anyway, I'm sure it'll get better once the puppy grows older.
I think you've got about 2 years of puppying before they settle down. They'll toilet train, but otherwise they're just a dog-sized puppy for about 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we've got a Labrador as well, so I'm sure, just that's sort of.
Oh, Labradors take about 5 years to get out of the puppy stage, don't they? Yeah.
I think it's not so bad if you've got an older dog there to sort of take the lead a little bit. It takes some of the pressure off of you.
That's me. I'm the older dog.
Oh. All right. Well, can you tell us about your professional career, please?
Yeah. So very fortunate to have operated and worked and lived in different places around the world. And I think really sort of Ireland, UK, Spain, and subsequently working in continental Europe, Middle East, then coming to Australia, then taking on global roles, having the opportunity to travel to the US, spend a lot of time in the US, Asia Pacific, and back again to Europe. So, continually on the move, continually striving to learn, and really always sort of in that sharp end of transformation and getting organizations to see why people and the people that they employ are critical to the organizational success. So I would probably end that by saying I do think people are sort of at the heart of everything that an organization has, and so looking after people isn't just something you have to do, it actually makes total sense and something that organizations really need to double down on.
And how long have you been in Australia?
I came here first in 2007. Had a couple of stints overseas even since then, but broadly on and off with a few sort of overseas stints, about 12, 13 years.
And you're at Mirvac now. How long have you had that role for?
Just 6 months, so relatively new at the moment, but very exciting. Mirvac's on a big kind of growth trajectory, and is looking to sort of double in size over the next 5 years. So very exciting. Good time to be at the organization, and some cool, exciting projects that we're about to lean into.
Yeah, excellent. And for those who are unfamiliar with Mirvac, can you give us a kind of sense of what the company does and the sort of scale that you operate at?
Sure. So Mirvac's a life cycle or a full property life cycle company, and what I mean by that is it does investment, development, construction, and operation. It's traditionally been focused on the residential sector, but over the last number of years has really developed some of its other sectors, including office, commercial, retail, and industrial. So it's kind of your one-stop shop for all things property. And as I say, it's now embarking on a couple of new exciting products like mixed use, which is a blend of different product types all being brought together, and ultimately in that sort of urban regeneration space where we take parts of cities that maybe aren't the best and we try and recreate those and reimagine those, and turn them into something that's kind of inclusive and beneficial for society and for the cities in question. So some cool things happening in Sydney and Melbourne, hopefully in Perth and Brisbane. We'll be doing some similar sort of big mixed-use projects. So exciting times at Mirvac.
Yeah. So for those listeners who are in health and safety, what do you do in the first 6 months when you join an organisation like Mirvac?
I think I'll use the word that I used earlier in terms of, something that's been a part of my kind of modus operandi for a while. It's listening, and a lot of listening. A lot of sense making and engaging with people. So yes, you can look at data, and yes, you can look at information, but I think conversationally engaging with a broad spectrum of people across the organization, from the board down to the front line, and just really trying to pick up on not just the spoken and or written rules and ways of working in an organization, but some of that sort of unspoken silent running kind of stuff that happens in a company, and you don't really find out about it until you actually speak to people and engage with them. It's really been a journey of kind of exploration and discovery, and now starting to formulate some ideas around how and where we might need to focus on certain things.
Yeah, and you've recently made an addition to your team. I'm not sure if that's public knowledge yet.
It is, yes, yeah. So we've, we're extremely fortunate to be able to call on Amanda Clements, who I'm sure a number of people listening would be familiar with. Amanda was obviously at ProBuild and had the opportunity to, move on with what happened at ProBuild, and we were very fortunate to have a conversation and be able to outline to Amanda the Mirvac project and some of the things we want to do, particularly in, the psychological health and safety space, and probably the work-related psychosocial risks in particular. So Amanda's been on board about a month, maybe 3 weeks, a month, and already we can see the impact she's going to have. So it's great, very excited.
Yeah, great get, as we said off air, and we're a fan of Amanda. She's been on a live panel with us before for an industry focused event. So great get, mate.
Thank you.
So what would you say is the level of maturity currently as far as workplace mental health goes in the construction industry?
Look, I think it's the word I use is it's obvious in that, and in a way it's similar to how things are in society. There is a recognition of the problem, which I think is important and probably the first step. It's getting conversed about more and more, even at a leadership and executive level. And unfortunately, there have been some very high-profile things that have happened even in the last number of days and weeks in and around, people potentially committing suicide as a consequence of some of the pressures that are now emerging in this particular industry with supply chain pressures, etc. So it's certainly something that's getting spoken about more, and there's certainly an awareness. The flip side to that is, and the reason why I use the term obvious is because I'm not sure people understand much about it and or what needs to be done in response to it. And I think what's happened, and again, we spoke a little bit about this off air, it feels like companies have responded to it in a kind of a scattergun. Let's just throw lots of things at this and see if we can kind of land on something that might help. But I'm not sure a lot of people are taking a scientific approach to actually understanding what the extent of the problem is and what some of the things that could be put in place to deal with that might look like. So just starting out would be my summary, but at least there is that awareness, and at least the conversation is now starting to be had.
Yeah, so I think that reflects some of the comments from a previous podcast with Rob Briner around, we know that there's a problem, so we'll try to throw solutions at it. But really there's a step that needs to come before that, which is understanding the problem and really doing a proper diagnosis of the organization and understanding what the causes are that are creating that problem, rather than just trying to go straight to throwing solutions at it. So it sounds like you've observed a similar sort of trend in the construction industry.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think the other thing to say is the way that the problems manifest are actually quite different depending on the type of role or the type of situation that people find themselves in. So I think a frontline worker and somebody that's working for a tier 3, tier 4 level company and what it means for them is very, very different to, say, the executive of a tier 1 contractor or developer, and what the topic might mean for them or how it might manifest for them. So again, a kind of a multifaceted, multi-dimensioned approach to this in this industry, I think, is going to be pretty critical, because it is manifesting in all different kinds of ways, just because of the kind of dynamic and diverse nature of the industry that we're involved in.
Yeah, and so if you think about the types of hazards that are going to create distress for people, that that sort of tier 4 contractor, you're really thinking about things like job security and income security, and those types of things are going to be the bigger pressures. Whereas for an exec, it's a whole different set of hazards, really. So that it is important to really not only have the diagnosis, but to understand the exposures for your different groups or different types of members of the workforce. Yeah. So you mentioned there's been sort of a scattergun approach. Have you seen any companies that are starting to approach this in a more systematic way, like from the perspective of maybe ISO 45003, or looking at, the requirements of the psych health regulations that we've seen so far?
Yeah, I think there are. I think that certainly has focused the mind somewhat for those that firstly are aware of those particular elements. I guess that itself is somewhat of a concern, in that you'd be surprised how many people you speak to actually even aren't even aware of the codes of practice or the emerging ISO standards. So that's somewhat of a concern. But those that are, and I would include Mirvac in the bracket of organisations that are, they're certainly now starting to have the conversation in and around, what is it about the work environment? What is it about work itself? The sort of psychosocial risk component of work, and what are some of the things that we should be doing in response to that? I would say, some of the peers of Mirvac are similarly doing that, and I know a number of the big four, consulting firms and some of the larger banks and financial institutions are also sort of part of this. In a previous life, I sat on the board of the Corporate Mental Health Alliance Australia, and that was made up of sort of the top 20 ASX companies, and certainly at board level and amongst the working group level, there was a lot of conversation on what these standards will mean and what is it that organisations need to do in response to that. So I would say at the top end of town, on an ASX sort of level, there is certainly an emerging conversation and people are understanding their obligations. But I think once you start to move outside of that sort of realm, then again, it's back to this awareness, and I'm not sure there's enough people aware of this and indeed having the conversations that they should be having at this stage.
Yeah, so I guess a similar pattern to what you would see for more broadly safety management, I suppose, in that same way, where you would tend to see the more mature and well-established systems in those sort of tier one level organizations, and then as you get further and further down the contractor chain, and talking in generalities here, tend to see just less robust systems and not as mature an understanding of safety management generally.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. Yeah.
So what would you say are the main barriers for construction companies to actually adopt a systematic approach to psychosocial risk?
Well, firstly, I think understanding. So, as I said at the outset, there's a lot of misconceptions in and around this. I think even the terminology, and maybe a need to demystify some of the terminology. Actually, Amanda and I were speaking about this morning, and how interchangeable psychological health and safety, psychological safety, psychosocial risk factors, mental health, mental well-being. It depends on the person you speak to, or it depends on the entity that you're engaging with. People just throw these terms around without necessarily understanding what it is they exactly mean. So I think for me, one of the key things would be an actual sort of education and awareness piece around what are we actually trying to do with this particular topic, and explaining to people the differences between those different elements. Because right now you just get a lot of people speaking either in generalities or interchangeably using terms and probably not understanding what they're referring to. That's probably point number one. Point number two, and without stating the bleeding obvious, is it's very hard. And I think the thing that most organizations grapple with, and again, in a previous life at Woolworths, I can recall a lot of discussion around how do you differentiate between what the person brings to work versus what the person acquires whilst at work, and what is the role of the organization in and around dealing with and managing those two things, and the stewardship, or how people should respond to that. And again, education, awareness, and just debate and discussion around that, I think, are things that don't happen enough. And where does the role of the organization end, and where does the role of society and health systems and other things start, and sort of the blurring of lines and how you manage all of that. So I think people feel somewhat challenged and overwhelmed by that particular aspect. And then the third thing I would say is there's definitely a fear factor as well, particularly in the context of workers' compensation claims. And almost, if I acknowledge the fact that I'm not doing things quite as well as I should, oh my goodness, I'm admitting, culpability, and people will take me to court, or people will sue me, or people will put in a claim. And so again, a lot of kind of ignorance in and around, what the role of the organization needs to be in those sort of areas. So I think awareness is underpinning all of that, but a lot of needing to kind of demystify this topic and be very clear as to what we mean by the different aspects, and then giving people some clear direction around how they can kind of respond to some of that.
Yeah, the what's personal and what's work related is is one that I guess is an easy challenge to bring up, or an easy barrier to put up. But if we think about it from a physical health and safety perspective, if somebody went to music festivals on the weekend, you wouldn't stop giving them hearing protection at work. So you still recognize that there's a work-based hazard exposure that you're responsible for as an employer, and what they may or may not be exposed to in their life outside of work is outside of your control. But what's within your control is what they're exposed to in the workplace. And so, you need to look at ways to reduce exposure to that. And that's sort of the way that I think about that anyway. And then the other side of that is, making accommodations. And if somebody broke their leg while they were playing sport on the weekend, you wouldn't then bring them back to work and expect them to be able to, do their job standing up all day if that's what's required of them. You make reasonable accommodations for them to be able to, do alternate duties or something like that while they've got that broken leg and while that's healing. So again, you can sort of apply the same thought process to, if somebody is going through a divorce or grief, or because they've had a bereavement or something like that, you make accommodations in the workplace for that in the same way that you would for a physical injury. Different kinds of accommodations probably, but you can still apply that same thinking, I think, to those challenges.
Yeah, look, I think that's fair, but I think the question was specific to probably my industry and the property construction industry more broadly, and one shouldn't forget the kind of undertone of kind of macho culture that has perpetuated this industry for probably forever. And so I think what you're grappling with as well is some of that in the context of the organization sort of going, well, this is kind of a tough industry, or concrete's pretty hard kind of yard, so maybe the person should be tough enough to begin with to be able to deal with that sort of stuff. And by the way, I'm not saying any of that is right. On the contrary, it's appalling. And you kind of wonder why people don't want to join the industry. Well, there you go. That's that's the kind of mood or the attitude that's perpetuating the industry. Then it shouldn't come as a surprise as to why females and or others that may feel like threatened by some of that wouldn't want to be in that kind of an industry. So I think all of that is contributing to just the kind of lack of bravery or courage among some of these organizations to take that step to go reimagine this industry in a whole different paradigm, where it's caring, where it's empowering, where it is about, we would be a place where we will support you and help you deal with anything that you're grappling with, be it on a personal front or be it as a, in combination with some of the things that you have to deal with in a work sense. So, education and awareness, and again, just bringing people on that journey is going to be front and center to making the change.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're really talking about a sort of transformational change in some of the core assumptions in those organizations that really needs to happen.
Absolutely. And look, there are people doing that. I think Alison Mirvac, I don't know if you've come across Alison Mirvac, she's CEO of a construction company. She's starting to push the envelope a little bit in some of that, talking about 4-day weeks and 5-day weeks, and respecting people's work-life balance. And Mirvac's just been recently recognized as the most diverse company in the world for the amount of kind of effort we're putting into bringing in people from different backgrounds, more women in the workforce, etc. So all of that, and maybe it's not coincidental that those two companies are led by females. All of that's going to have to be something that really this industry kind of doubles down on over the next while, which I think then support some of the things that we're talking about in terms of psychological health and safety, and those, particularly those psychosocial risk factors, which are almost in some instances are given currently still in terms of the amount of time people have to spend at work, the physical or mental exertions that they have to put themselves under to deliver projects, etc. All of that stuff has to be tackled head on.
Mm.
Yeah, I wonder, Brian, how much of what you were saying before, what's the responsibility of the employer and what's the responsibility of the individual, or vice versa? How much of that has come down to historically how we've dealt with mental health in the workplace, which has largely been driven by more a public health approach rather than a health and safety approach. So there's a proliferation, obviously, of EAP, mental health first aid, peer support programs, that sort of thing, which are really tertiary reactive in nature. And, it's not necessarily the same way that we addressed physical hazards, right? Or not how we first started to address physical risks. It wasn't, let's give everyone access to sports massage and physiotherapy during working hours. It's like, well, let's actually think about their role and make it safer by dealing with and creating safe systems of work and safe methods of work. So yeah, it's interesting where we found ourselves, because I think maybe we started in the wrong place and now we're trying to have to backtrack a bit and go more upstream.
Yeah, look, I think that's correct. Although I would say you'd be very surprised on a hierarchical level how, in a physical safety sense, there is still an overriding emphasis on fixing the person. And if it wasn't, and I'm quoting here, sort of somewhat facetiously, but if it wasn't for the dumb person that made the mistake, we wouldn't have accidents. And you'd be very surprised how, unfortunately, common some of those comments are still kind of, prevalent in our industry. So, yes, I agree that the sophistication in the physical safety sense has evolved over time, but maybe not as much as it should have. And I actually think there's a huge opportunity to learn lessons from health and safety, both on the positive side of things and how physical safety and health and safety evolve, but also on the negative side of things. And to your point, actually make a real inroad now at the start of this journey to go, let's stop putting the emphasis on people. Let's put the emphasis on the organization. Let's go higher up the hierarchy. Let's look at technology. Let's look at substitution and elimination of risk, or in engineering out the problem to begin with. Because unfortunately, as I say, there's still a significant reliance on administrative and PPE type controls in the physical safety realm. When you look at the risk profiles of some of these companies and you think, well, that should not be the case. And ironically, that in itself is leading to psychological pressure and, people feeling somewhat, apprehensive and overwhelmed by the situations that they've been placed in. So I think your comment is spot on, but I would caution and say maybe the safety side of things is nowhere near as sophisticated or developed as it should be, even some 40 years into what is kind of an industrial safety landscape.
Yeah. The concept of just culture has been around for decades, right? And, I guess more and more companies do that. I mean, it's something that we practice here, in terms of software development, underneath a certified information security management system approach. If there are errors made, it's like, well, what contributed to that? It wasn't just someone's mistake. It was, well, how did the person make that mistake? What were the systems that let that person down? And you're right. Not every company has adopted that approach. They still look to blame the individual, and we definitely see probably a much greater proliferation of that in mental health than we do in the physical health space, though. So, physical health, like you say, isn't quite there yet in every company, but I think we can all agree mental health has a long way to go to just even catch up to where physical health and safety is.
Sure. Yeah. No, I agree. 100%.
Yeah. Now, Brian, you and I have something in common, and that is that we both used to be employed by Woolworths. Admittedly, you're a few rungs up the ladder from where I was as a casual Woolworths liquor assistant.
A purveyor of alcoholic beverages.
Yeah, that's right. It's a perfect job for a young 20-something-year-old when I was going through university. So perfect. But I remember even when I was doing that 20 years ago, there was a move from pallets to the cages to reduce, the manual handling, or, manual handling obviously in retail is probably one of the biggest physical risks. There's already moves back then, right, to change systems of work to make it, to try and, engineer or improve, some of the principles around manual handling to reduce the load on staff. So yeah, that was 20 years ago, right? And we're still not seeing the same focus on systems of work in the mental health space. But given that you have worked, quite a lot of your career in this construction engineering kind of environment, but you did do that stint in retail, what were some of the bigger differences that you noticed in terms of how workplace mental health was addressed?
Yeah, I think the pace of retail is certainly different to the pace of construction and engineering. That's not to say that in construction and engineering, pace and the kind of velocity of how things get done is an issue. It can be, but I think you get more peaks and troughs, whereas in retail, it's about always being on. So I think Woolworths and other retailers have recognized that and sort of looked at the physical and sort of mental resilience of people to be able to operate at that level continually and at a constant basis. And this was before the pandemic struck. So then when you overlay an external kind of derailer like the pandemic, then that just exacerbates that pressure. And people are already, kind of struggling as it is. So Woolworths responded to that very, very well in the context of, A, there was that recognition, which we've talked about initially. B, there was the active conversation at board and executive level to go, this isn't sustainable. Our industry is our industry. We understand that the pace of retail is what it is, but that shouldn't get in the way of us actually taking steps to help people. So I think the opportunity then to look at some of the more kind of ingrained ways of working within a retail setting was what Woolworths started to do. And this was sort of when I was transitioning up, but looking at rostering, looking at the amount of breaks, looking at the opportunity for people to get both physical and mental downtime. The notion of a kind of a peer-to-peer network that was set up at Woolworths under the banner of I Am Here, which was basically having trained up people, not in a mental health first aid sense, but more in a considerate, caring colleague sense that, could kind of put their arms around people physically or metaphorically and help them along, but with the kind of expectation that they would be guided to professional help and support if required. So really just that injection of care into the mix, recognizing that retail's pretty full on, pretty fast paced, and that not getting in the way of, sort of us looking after people's mental health really was, I think, a big unlock for the organization. And I know other retailers are following suit. So that's probably the biggest comparison. It's the pace of retail drove the need for people to really amp things up and do things, in support of people. Whereas I think in construction and engineering, maybe it isn't as evident and maybe it isn't as extreme in terms of how people are feeling with regards to pressure and some of the challenges that they're dealing with. So, that sort of burning platform to respond maybe isn't as evident as it was in retail. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but there's probably just a direct comparison between those two industries.
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about psych hazards, then like you say, it's more the constant kind of work demands in retail versus the peaks and troughs in more construction. So there might be periods of downtime and maybe even roll underload at some points, and then you've got very dramatic changes in that, and it can go to roll overload pretty quickly as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Look, so let's have a bit of a chat about resilience engineering and sort of how that applies to the psych health and safety field. So I guess, resilience engineering is about having organizational systems established to predict, detect, respond, and learn. And that obviously then relies on people and their adaptive capacities within an organization to be able to enact those systems, I suppose. How do you see that interacting with psych health and safety?
Yeah, look, I mean, for me, it feels like something that if we got right could be a real unlock for this topic. And it goes back to a lot of what we've been talking about over the last 10 or 15 minutes. There is a logical need for organizations to rely on their people, to deliver the strategic objectives of an organization. And, the conversation around AI and tech and all this stuff coming in and kind of, I guess, helping organizations be less reliant on people is valid and real, but that's the reality. Is it's not going to happen for a long period of time, and particularly in those smaller scale organizations, it's probably not going to happen for even longer than that. So the reality is we're always going to rely on people to help deliver the goals and objectives of an organization. Where I think it gets very tricky is when the kind of pressures and just the way of doing business is put into a position whereby you have to operate outside of the ordinary kind of expected envelope of tolerance, or people are being forced to do things just to react to a particular issue. And there isn't a recognition around how finite people are and just how, I guess, brittle people can become when pushed beyond their kind of safe operating envelope. So I'm very curious to understand, not just in the context of adaptive capacity in people as a concept, but actually how you can build that adaptive capacity in a safe way, and or you can build in mechanisms in your organizational kind of way of working which can detect when individuals are getting close to that sort of safe operating envelope, or their sort of brittleness piece. So that to me feels like almost lead indicator territory, and that ability for us to kind of have a precursor to before somebody suffers a mental breakdown or suffers some difficulty, by focusing in on their capacity and their adaptive capacity, and having the ability to detect when they're getting too close to burnout or some of the other negative impacts that they might be exposed to. Feels like a part of this science that really could be a big unlock for people to look at and to measure.
Yeah, okay. So that sort of goes, I guess, that where we see resilience training for people at the moment, it's about giving them skills to be resilient. But what you're talking about is more creating ways of identifying where individuals are getting to the limits of their personal resilience.
That's correct. But having, I guess, ways of being able to understand what are some of the things that can lead people to those bad places, or to those places of their limits, such that the organization can wind itself back from pushing people to those places, or put additional or different measures in place such that the individual isn't the person that's going to suffer and or be pushed to kind of breaking point. And there's not a lot happening in that space at the moment, in and around that sort of preemptive or preventative approach to some of that. It's very much, and if I use our industry as an example, first and foremost, you're grappling with the cultural expectation that I talked about earlier. This is a hard industry, so kind of suck it up. And then the second thing is, I think there's a real issue with men in particular, almost not wanting to acknowledge brittleness and or acknowledge the fact that they're getting to a point of brittleness. So unless industries like construction kind of steer into that and find ways of detecting that without backing somebody into a corner or putting them into a difficult spot, then the sense would be that unfortunately people will almost kind of learn how to hide this and learn how to kind of not want to acknowledge or admit to this. And lo and behold, they are creeping towards their point of breaking point, or their point of brittleness, and organizations are kind of blissfully ignorant as to that being the panorama that they're operating in. And then you get these big failures because people burn out, or people break down, or they lack concentration, or they make a bad decision, and then people wonder why that happens. So it's really the protection of the individual and being able to determine or decipher when that individual is getting close to their breaking point feels like a real opportunity in the kind of monitoring and measurement space.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sort of thinking about that. And there's links here to what we were talking about earlier in terms of, you know, blaming the worker for the decisions or actions that they've taken in a safety scenario. But, you know, this sort of this idea of trade-offs, and you're talking about, you know, where there's increasing pace of work and increasing work demands on people, you know, and they're needing to make those trade-off decisions between, well, you know, this is the deadline and this is going to impact our bonus or whatever it might be. But then this is what the rules say that I need to do from a safety perspective. And those two things are essentially mutually exclusive. I can't meet both of those demands. So, you know, what is the trade-off that's going to be acceptable, and how many of those are we actually putting on the shoulders of individual employees, or, you know, sort of frontline employees? How many people are they answering to? You know, all of those kinds of pressures. And I think, yeah, there's a really strong alignment there between mental health and safety outcomes, traditional safety outcomes.
And indeed business outcomes. I think, you know, executives are probably pressured into dealing and grappling with those trade-offs continually, and particularly in a Western working world context. You know, people like David Woods and Eric Hall-Nagel in the safety research space, they're pretty convinced, based on empirical evidence, that it actually is the individual worker and or the person that 9 times out of 10 gets the company kind of out of a difficult spot. But because that's almost a given or expected, there's a sort of blissful ignorance in and around the fact that even was that, you know, almost close to that level of failure yet. Because Johnny or Mary is such an amazing employee and puts the needs of the company above their own needs, you know, we didn't have the failure. But I think the second part to that whole equation is, what's the impact like for Johnny or Mary to be continually expected to do that time after time after time, if the structural setup of the organization is over-indexing the individual always being the person that stops the failure from eventuating? And no matter how sophisticated organizations are, my sense is, even in, you look at the legal profession, you look at the consulting world, you look at financial services, construction, retail, unfortunately, even in 2022, it's the people that are getting the organizations out of the difficult scenarios, not the AI or not the tech or not the other elements that exist within those socio-technical systems. And yet, I'm not sure we're asking the most important question in all of that, which is, what is the impact on the person who's gotten that organization out of that difficult scenario? And would we even know? Would we even know how to detect that?
Yeah, and people know that as well. So as an individual, when you're in that situation, you're fully aware that you're taking on the risk by making that trade-off decision. You're also fully aware that the organization is doing that to you, you know, and that's something that it works for them. It's in their best interest to do that. And so then that leads me to sort of down the path of thinking about moral injury, you know, where you are actually being betrayed on a daily basis by your employer, and they're sort of violating that psychological contract and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think, you know, aspirationally, you sort of look at a number of these barometers or measures that exist globally. There's a trust barometer, there's the ESG monitoring, but, you know, some of an ability to detect almost the moral contract between employer and employee and how well that is being upheld, which in turn then has direct linkages to individual resilience and your ability to detect somebody getting into a dangerous position before actually they get to burnout or whatever the case may be. Wouldn't that be an amazing thing to measure and rank organizations by in terms of that charter that they've set with their employee base, and how close or far away they are from that charter gives you an indication of how morally correct they are in the context of care and looking after people.
So PhD students in our listenership, there you go. Topic.
Yeah, no, it's an incredibly interesting one. This is a generational issue. It's going to take a while to really uncover that, but I really love where you're going, Brian. I love the idea of data informing kind of predictive predictive of outcomes. And if you can get that data as a leading indicator and intervene before harm occurs, then wouldn't that be a great place to be in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say a lot of the inputs into this work-related psychosocial risk factors that I've read up on and just explored, some forensic measurement of the application of those things and the deviations from that would be a good place to start in and around building that kind of resilience indicator in and around how organizations, I guess, start to lean more towards the organizational resilience, and that being the thing that they really need to bolster and buffer, as opposed to just defaulting to, well, I'll just rely on the adaptive capacity of my amazing people because they're all heroes and they're brilliant and, you know, we'll reward them. Yes, yet if we could measure the effectiveness of some of those elements that go into, you know, creating, you know, a safe place to work and such that the psychosocial risk factors are eliminated or managed accordingly, that I think would be a start in terms of just organizational resilience in the context of how well or poorly an organization is doing that.
Yeah, that's definitely what we're interested in. Now, it's clear if we think about the safety profession in its entirety, Brian, it's clear that regardless of whether they want to or not, they're going to be dragged into the workplace mental health portfolio. It's largely been to date in the HR or benefits portfolio. But now with the ISO 45003 standard, the Psych health regs coming in, the codes of practice that are coming out around Australia, this is becoming more of a health and safety issue as well, and particularly requiring safety people to bring their expertise around risk management. So do you see any resistance from people in the profession getting involved in workplace mental health?
I don't see resistance, but I see apprehension, and I see a little bit like what we talked about in terms of the organizational piece right at the start today. I see a lack of understanding and maybe, dare I say, a little bit of ignorance as to, you know, what that actually might mean. So I wouldn't classify it as resistance, but I'd certainly classify it as kind of some levels of apprehension around what does that mean for me, and, you know, what does it mean for kind of my day-to-day workload and what I have to do, not do in the context of some of this. But again, I'm not sure how many within the profession have a, you know, kind of developed enough understanding of the topic such that they could actually make an informed answer to that particular question.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that we have identified, and that's obviously one of the reasons for the podcast, our 45,003 Training Academy, to kind of bridge that knowledge and competence gap. So let's assume that the safety profession rapidly increases their competence and comprehension of psychosocial risk management. What are some other potential barriers for them getting involved?
I think internally in most organizations, the HR division would probably feel like they would have quite a role to play in and around this, particularly if you look at, again, some of the inputs that we've touched on in the sort of psychosocial risk world. And I'm thinking there about, you know, the way sort of working time is allocated, or you know, the work environment itself, the expectations in and around that. So today, a lot of that, rightly or wrongly, sits within the HR domain. So I think one of the things that would need to be kind of stared into and overcome pretty quickly quickly is people understanding, who does what, who's got responsibility for what, and which bits fall within the sort of realm of health and safety, and which bits fall somewhere else. That probably feels like something that would need to be again, education, awareness, get people to understand what the topic is and why it would make more sense for this to sit within the health and safety practice as opposed to some other practice. The other big fear I have with this is a little bit in line with what happened with the model health and safety laws, and I know in WA that's recently just been enacted. If the legal profession and the lawyers get too aggressive in their ownership for this, and indeed in their scaremongering in and around boards and executives around what can happen if you don't get on top of this, this will quickly deteriorate into a compliance exercise again. And so, back to what we talked about earlier, the lessons learned from health and safety, I just hope that we don't get into that kind of a place where you scaremonger and through fear get people to kind of, roll up some generic response to, a new standard or the ISO standard, because that will completely set us back. So they're probably the two big barriers I would see. One is just clarity around ownership and why it makes sense for HSE to own this. And I think there are plenty of reasons as to why. And then secondly, let's not turn this into a compliance kind of obligation that organizations have to step up to. And once they fill in a form or do a yearly briefing of their board or something, they've ticked the box and, yeah, I do psychosocial risk, I'm good, we're good, can we move on to the next shiny thing? There would be the two sort of red flags.
Yeah, and they're definitely two things that we've identified ourselves in conversation. Just recently, Joelle's actually put together a RACI chart, which actually looks at the different kind of functional teams that will have and need to participate, I guess, in workplace mental health, particularly under the Psych, Health and Safety banner. And yeah, there's heaps, right, Joelle? But it really is about having that discussion really early on, I guess, when implementing something like this and going, well, who's responsible for what? And what can health and safety do that may be better than what HR can do, and vice versa. And we're already starting to see what the second fear that you have with, compliance going, well, all right, we've been given a notice of improvement, for example, around how we're dealing with psychosocial hazards. So quick, we need to show that we're responding to this. So often what happens is a top-down risk assessment, very minimal amount of consultation with the broader workforce. And then you end up with a bunch of policies and administrative controls to deal with the risk, to show the regulator that you've actually done something where we know, and then they might have a plan to revisit that in 12 or 18 months. Completely ignoring how dynamic the workplace is and how psych hazards can come and go very quickly. So we're definitely seeing that second one, and but we are also having some very positive conversations with companies who want to do it the right way. Right? It's not just about box ticking. They actually want to have a safety management system that's effective in actually really understanding these hazards and putting in controls that eliminate, if possible, or looking at job redesign as the way to go about it.
Yeah, look, and I think back to the resilience engineering or the adaptive capacity conversation prior, a big part of that will be creating cultures and environments whereby it's okay to speak up, or it's okay to acknowledge fallibility or weakness or a growth or need to develop, improve, enhance. And so, the sort of enemy of that could be very much that over-reliance on compliance and tick the box. So again, you just have to be very, very careful in the way that organizations will embrace the need to improve their management systems and to absolutely adopt the standard. But it can't be to the extent whereby it kind of drives that, openness, transparency, willingness to develop, grow and learn and improve sort of into the sort of back part of the organization, because then you really are just turning it into another compliance exercise, which as we know, again, in the physical health and safety world, it never works. And the organizations that have been successful are the ones that have continually reinvented themselves and never lost that kind of need to always, there's a great term used in the process safety world called chronic unease. And in essence, what it's trying to do is to get the leadership and the executive to always ask, where could the next thing happen? Like, are we thinking? Are we learning? Are we wanting to keep evolving? And if you overdo compliance, you're just going to kill that spirit and kill that way of thinking.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to see what evolves with the new regs coming out and the amount of box ticking versus actual effective practice in this space. And if the former happens, if it's just box ticking and not actually effective practices, how quickly or what the regulator can do to actually get people to change, backtrack, and think about regulation, redoing the regs or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's. I mean, that's sort of what I've been saying all along, is that we just don't know until we actually see the draft regs. We don't know what that's going to look like. And hopefully it does keep it as sort of less prescriptive and more around, these are the outcomes that you need to achieve, or, these are the, maybe the steps you need to take, without being really prescriptive around saying, well, you need to look at, at this group of 5 hazards, because that's obviously not going to get us where we need to be.
It's just before we move on, it's really great to see what WorkSafe Victoria are doing, though. They've been very vocal in saying, hey, policy and education are not adequate controls for the majority of psychosocial hazards. They're saying you need to look at higher order controls, so elimination and job redesign, right? So it's good that they're on the front foot and going, well, no, you can't just put all a list of your policies in your risk register and say that you're done. It's positive to see that, at least. Yeah,
but without then sort of dictating what
correct,
what job design needs to happen, and I think that's the critical aspect of that as well.
Needs that flexibility. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. There's one other thing as well, just on all of that I probably forgot to mention earlier, but it's something that's been in the back of my mind for a while, and that is the extent to which the sort of dominant organization with multiple sort of subcontractors and or subcontractors has to go in this space, and what are the expectations, potentially through regulation and other means that will be put onto those kind of PCBU or the dominant organization. Because when I look at what's happened again in the health and safety space, that's created a whole lot of confusion, and what it's actually led to is a lot of sort of I guess deliberate attempts by organizations to go, well, we'll look after the main body, which is all people, but that's the principal contractor, so that's nothing to do with us, or that's and so I think, again, that's, if I could speak candidly, I think that's set back the physical health and safety world, because it's sort of introduced this false sense of, well, it's nothing to do with us, that's the subcontractor, so we don't have to worry about that. Whereas I think the intent of the legislation was, as the kind of dominant and or principal bigger entity in the chain here, you should be taking a very sort of responsible stance and trying to influence and have a positive influence on your supply chain, on your subcontractors, etc. But because people are quite scared of all of that and overreaching in terms of what they should be doing down the chain, then they tend to kind of go back into the shell and not want to touch subcontractors and entities. And so again, I think anything that we can learn from that in this world will be critical, because the bigger the organization, the more influencing power and the more opportunity there is to influence and shape the lives of others in a good way. So we can't lose sight of that, and certainly that's a lesson to be learned from the last 10 years in physical health and safety.
So, Brian, it's been a really fascinating chat with you today. Really appreciate your time for someone who's had such held senior roles in health and safety in some very notable organisations, and to get some of your wisdom, particularly in this particular space, as we've talked about, the health and safety profession has a long way to come and a lot of barriers to overcome. But a question that we ask all of our guests on the show is, if you were to look into the future, what would your hopes for the future of workplace mental health be?
Well, firstly, I think there'd be a much greater level of understanding in and around the topic. I think it wouldn't be kind of tokenistic or the next kind of shiny thing that people have to embrace. It will be assumed and accepted as part and parcel of running a business, that is an obligation that the board and the chief executive and others have to take on and have to do right by. So that's probably the first thing. Secondly, I would think that it would be seen from a shareholder and or interested parties perspective as actually a real determining factor in how well an organization is being run. So much like ESG has introduced itself into the mix in terms of being a true indicator of organizational performance, and not quite at the level of the financial indicators, but certainly more and more, particularly for investors, as a real determining factor when it comes to understanding whether an organization is successful or not. Why wouldn't we want to look at how well this particular topic is being managed, and indeed how well people are feeling as a consequence of working within a particular company? So I think they would probably be my two standout things. One would be a belief that the awareness and understanding is consistent, and that people aren't just bluffing about the topic. They actually know what they're talking about, and it's owned by board and management. And then secondly, wouldn't it be amazing that maybe ESGW or ESGM became the kind of acronym that people are using to define non-financial success or non-financial criteria within an organization. So yeah, that's probably just off the top of my head the two things that would come to mind, because I think it has to go to the purpose and soul of the organization, and unless it is ingrained within why an organization exists, it's always going to be somewhat tokenistic, and that's the shift, really.
Yeah, I've really heard of some groups internationally that are trying to get an H put on the end of ESG to encompass, overall health of the employee group, physical and mental. Whether it could just fit under the S, I don't know, but I think that's a great future to be in, where a company is evaluated not just on financial performance, but also how well they look after their people.
And we have a long way to go, unfortunately, because if you look at the SDG, the UN compact metrics, or you look at the DJSI index or some of the other indexes that most organizations leverage, it's pretty disappointing when you look at the metrics that they currently use to determine those, the health of workforces and or the overall health, safety, well-being sense of a workforce. So yeah, maybe that's something that Australia could take a lead on and try and influence some of these major global players to actually introduce proper metrics into the way they determine something like that.
Yeah, well, what we found in, speaking to an international audience ourselves is that Australia might be small, but we have a very good reputation around both health and safety and how we talk about and do mental health. So we actually can have quite an influence, I think, on the global stage. It's kind of like selling, I say it's like selling German cars internationally. People have a good perception of them. And I think Australia has a great reputation in both health and safety and mental health.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
So do you have any words of advice for listeners who want to work in the field of psych health and safety?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. Look, I think first and foremost, for young people that are probably considering career options, if you actually think about this topic, and from an altruistic sense, think about the good you could actually impart and do to the world. Arguably, if people can get kind of their arms around this and start to influence and make change happen within their respective organizations, then my goodness, they're going to do some really good things And that's a very nice thing actually to think about, that, you know, you could be employed in a role whereby, as a consequence of how good you are at influencing the leaders of an organization, you can actually improve the lives of people. There's not a lot of jobs that you can kind of say that about, but I think this is one that you could. And I know that's something that's driven me in my career, probably fundamentally on the physical health and safety side, but in latter years also on the mental health side. So that would be probably point number one. Point number two is I would posit that no 2 days would ever be the same, just because of the dynamic nature and, you know, the adaptive nature of human beings and people and how people react to things. So I think it would be a very exciting and dynamic, you know, thing to be involved in. And then thirdly, maybe to Jason's point, you know, there's an aspect of pioneering here where people that come into this and, you know, want to challenge convention, want to challenge some of these kind of industry norms and industry accepted practices, and working with regulators and people like yourselves, you know, start to make change, then, you know, who's to say that Australia can't pioneer some of this and really, you know, be part of a major change globally. So, you know, if I step back from that, there are three pretty compelling reasons as to why somebody thinking about their next career move might be motivated to want to be a part of this.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Brian, again, thank you so much for coming. That brings us to the end of the podcast. Really stoked for you and your new role and what you're going to be doing at Mirvac with the amazing Amanda Clement. So we look forward to seeing the changes there and to see Mirvac really leading the way in this space in the coming months and years will be amazing. But thank you again for your time.
No, and thank you, and thank you to both of you as well for just the way you you know, you're pushing this topic, and what you're doing is pretty special. So we're definitely keen to keep discussing that and how that would work within a Mirvac context as well. But thanks for the opportunity. Loved it. Great. Appreciate
it, mate. All right, listeners, that brings us to the end of the episode. So just remember that we do video these with our amazing guests. So if you do want to catch the video, if you prefer that over the podcast medium, you can check it out on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. We'll also take some of the short clips, and there'll be a couple of really good ones that Joelle will pull from this discussion, no doubt, and that will be on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page. And while you're over on LinkedIn, if you want to continue the discussion, you know, feel free to reach out to Joelle or myself, and Brian's a pretty approachable guy too, if you've got some questions around what he talked about in today's episode. So thanks again, listeners. We'll catch you next episode.